Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's podcast, the Rose and Rubini podcast. Quite an eventful week, both in the UK and in Italy, and two geographies which we're quite the experts in here at Rose and Rubini. This week, we're coming off of the end of the different Conservative and Labour Party conferences in the UK, but also looking at Giorgia Meloni and her future as the Prime Minister of Italy. And we want to discuss if Liz Truss's debacle can teach a lesson to Giorgia Meloni. Last week, we spoke about the mini budget, but as you said it, the not so mini budget that Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng had put forward. Let's pick up there. What are the recent updates on that?
So we spoke about the budget and why we thought it was an economic gamble. We weren't alone in that analysis, and actually there was an overt rebellion by the party members. But not just that, the general public, the market, policymakers around the world, the IMF sent effectively a message saying you need to revisit this. So lots of people in important kind of constituencies have their voice heard. But most importantly was the market. The market really didn't like it. Yeah. Started selling the pound like crazy, went to an historical low versus the dollar and the euro. Long-term rates shot up to the point that pension funds engaged in derivatives and LDIs, liability-driven investments, receive margin calls. They had to raise cash fast in order to respond to these margin calls. And the quickest way is, of course, selling the most liquid assets, so gilts, which meant that this further reinforced the sell-off in gilts. At the time, also, the central bank is doing QT, quantitative tightening. So we were a bit of in the middle of a mini liquidity crisis in the UK, and so the central bank had to step in. And with the program, 65 billion for the pension funds, intervention over the following fortnight, just to stabilize the market. That was quite a dramatic event that eventually led the government to a U-turn, and so they scrapped the cancellation of the 45% tax rate, which was symbolic measure anyway. It was symbolic on its way in, it was symbolic on its way out, and so eventually it was left alone. Most of the other parts of the program are still there, and we see that there are still tensions within the Tory party about benefits and so on. So tensions are not over, and the government still need to present the full budget in a few weeks. And clearly some of the proposed change will not be carried out, as clearly the market and other policymakers didn't like it.
All right. It's my understanding that the Office of Budget Responsibility generally would publish in a circumstance like this to accompany it with a forecast on economic growth or on sort of related fiscal deficit projections. It's my understanding they didn't do that this time. And then Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss met with the OBR to inject confidence in the market, but that still didn't come with any sign of sort of a U-turn in the government. Why do you think they made the decision to sort of meet with the OBR? What was the logic behind that? And why did that not result in any kind of success?
So budgets and what used to be the autumn statement, now it's called the spring statement, are always accompanied by new projections by the OBR, which are the foundation for the fiscal policy of the country. So clearly the OBR needs to give an independent evaluation and estimates of what or how they think the economy will perform in terms of GDP, employment, inflation, and all other key variables, such as current account deficit, of course, fiscal deficit based on all these assumptions. So effectively, this provides what is called the baseline for the government to start thinking about its programs. Given the baseline, the government then says, okay, we can make this measure, and this measure we expect to have this impact on the various variables, including the fiscal relevant variables. Now, since this was not a full-fledged budget, the government went ahead without those estimates. But that was somehow part of the problem, because it reinforced the idea that the government was working in isolation, was not consulting with all the relevant counterparties, such as the Bank of England, which was then asked to intervene, and the OBR, which provides the baseline. And that really didn't give a great sense of confidence on the abilities of the duo at the helm of the government and their ability to govern the process properly. Right. So it was a bit of a shambolic week. They tried to arrange a meeting with the OBR, which happened, but yet at that time, they did not provide any sign of a U-turn. That only came a couple of days later, when they saw that even that move was not helpful. So clearly this government still needs to put its act together and show that they are able to properly guide the country.
Right. And we keep asking ourselves, sort of comparative politics, making connections between two countries and seeing if there's anything that one leader can learn from another. Particularly, in the case of the UK and Italy, when both the leaders in sort of a precarious position. Giorgia Meloni in Italy with a relatively very new government and not the same sort of political stronghold, perhaps, that the Conservatives historically might have had in the UK. You point out in your views letter certain differences between these two leaders, particularly in their academic qualifications. And I'm wondering if you think that makes a significant difference in how they approach these things, or their policies on these issues, and how they kind of react to the backlash that provides.
So the point we were trying to make is the following. There has been lots of calls about the competence of Liz Truss becoming prime minister. The same way, same questions are asked about Giorgia Meloni. Now, and so when you want to ascertain whether somebody is competent enough to do the job is required, you need to look at his CV, to speak his or her CV. So Liz Truss did study one of the most important courses in the country, which is PPE, philosophy, economics and politics, very sought after course in Oxford that many prime ministers before her attended. Kwarteng himself studied at Eton and then did his academic degrees in Cambridge, including a PhD in economic history. So to some extent, the academic, so to speak, background is there. So they do have the needed foundations. Then Liz Truss has done the entire cursus honorum of a party member, coming from the low ranks and then up to junior ministerial role until very senior ministerial roles, such as foreign secretary, and then of course prime minister. In Italy, Meloni is coming from a weaker base because her academic qualifications are not even comparable. She has not studied at university, for example. She has not had any important ministerial role so far, only one position within the Berlusconi's government as the ministers of youth. And again, we are not talking about top ministerial positions, not economic development, is not foreign ministry, is and so one wonders what may happen in Italy when such an unqualified person gets the position, if qualified people in a country such as the UK can make such a mess in their first days in government. Now, I think it's a totally legitimate question to ask. To some extent, one has been way more prudent after the victory. She hasn't made huge declarations about what she intends to do. She hasn't tried to ascertain certain convictions, the same Liz Truss did. Liz Truss came to the position by saying, I will do this, I will do that. And I'm extremely convinced about these things. And this conviction is what led her decision making. Now, this is a bit funny for a person that has actually flip-flopped a few times. She was a liberal and she became conservative. She was pro-Remain, then she became pro-Brexit. So then she wants to do this huge tax cuts, and then she reversed. So it seems like when you're not very sure about the quality of what you do, you just say, I'm very convinced of what I'm doing. That's not good enough. So to some extent, Meloni seems to be less convinced, but more prudent, and that could prove a good move at this stage.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring up sort of academic qualifications into this when, we spoke about the OBR, and the OBR itself has said many times that Brexit, for instance, has resulted in, worse economic results objectively for the UK at large, but for small businesses in particular, which, the Conservative Party touted wouldn't happen. And, the OBR is what these politicians use to make their economic decisions. So it's very clear that certainly it's not necessarily a case of competence, you being unable to predict the consequence of these economic policies, but there's a whole confluence of political and macroeconomic factors at play. It's interesting to me also, I mean, we spoke about sort of Meloni being convinced and that being a sort of good move on her part. But there's also, we saw the central bank intervening in the UK, and this might potentially be something that could happen in Italy. How can, what can Meloni do about this to prevent this possibility happening and to sort of avoid a collision course in the markets?
Yeah, that's the real key point of this entire discussion. In the end, who cares about the academic qualification? Who cares about previous job post in government? If anything, Tony Blair came and was never in government before, and it was an excellent prime minister for most of his tenure. He was elected 3 times, so it's just pre-government chapters. Right. All this discussion about qualifications and so on. What really matters is how they perform once they are in charge. And so Truss, with all her outstanding qualifications, did a mess in the first few days. Perhaps Meloni comes with less qualifications, fewer qualifications, but then she could do extremely well by being prudent, for example. Yeah. And here is the point. Truss made a mess, but it was kind of easy for her to find a quick fix in the Bank of England. She kind of picked up the phone. Heuristically, I'm not saying this happened, I'm saying heuristically. You pick up the phone, you speak with that person, you say, look, try to fix this. They come up with the program. Within 24 hours, it was fixed. Yeah. But in the ECB and European Eurozone setting is way more complicated. Yeah. It's not that a prime minister can call the ECB and say, you do this, please. Yeah. Or can you please do that in a nicer way? It doesn't work like this. The ECB is totally independent. The way it operates, they are not, of course, deaf to what politicians say, but there's no way of constraining the way they work. And there's not one person deciding, there's a committee. There's first of all a board of 6 plus the entire governing council of 26. It's a huge community to convince. And then even if they were convinced, it's not that, oh, yes, let's do that because we think it's the right thing to do. No, they have a procedure, and the procedure now in place is called TPI. And the TPI is the anti-fragmentation facility, has 4 very stringent conditions, stringent, but quite discretionary. So it really depends on the interpretation that the governing council wants to make of how close the country is to meeting the criteria for being eligible for TPI intervention. So between the time in which the crisis kind of emerged and the time in which they intervene, the ECB can actually intervene, there are days, perhaps weeks, in which markets could be in turmoil. So the real lesson here for Giorgia Meloni is that she needs to be prudent, because she might end up being in a collision course with the EU and the ECB and the market way before she even knows it. So we kind of try to give 3 potential lessons that the Meloni can learn from the experience of Liz Truss. And these are, first of all, being a person of strong conviction is not good in itself if you are convinced about the wrong thing. So saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and it's wrong, and that is not liked by the market and other participants, whether they are the market or the policy environment, is not good enough. The second is that you should always be surrounded by the best people you can find. It's not just by minions and acolytes, people, yes men, yes women, people that always say yes to whatever you say, even if it's stupid, because that would take into trouble. The third is, don't go against the market, especially if you have a huge amount of debt to refinance, because then you're going to be your destiny is going to be in the hands of somebody else, whether it's the central bank, whether it's the market itself, whether there are other policymakers, other policy areas that need to intervene just to save the day. So these are 3 quick lessons that I think Giorgia Meloni may learn from the experience of Liz Truss of the last few days.
Yeah, no, we often associate the sort of first, couple of weeks that a prime minister might take office as a honeymoon phase, where they're really going around the country, they're establishing the agenda, they're making sure that the country knows about the cabinet they've appointed. And so that sort of honeymoon phase, as Liz Truss's government well shows, can be completely disrupted by just a fair few wrong moves, which ultimately might stem from this sort of over-reliance on being a person of conviction, but not a person of the right facts and sort of the right policies. No, it's very interesting. I mean, Giorgia Meloni, like you could have end off your newsletter saying, might well end up on a collision course with the markets and European authorities before we know it. And it's certainly a risk on the horizon that, clients in our audience should watch out for. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.